Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. We're going to have some fun today. You can see behind me, we've got 3 amplifiers, I got speaker cabs, we've got microphones, we've got a pedal board, and most of all, we have the rig doctor himself, Mason Marangella. Great to have you here, buddy. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me. This is kind of I think this may be the most cables that we may have ever used on any rig-related video that I've done at Sweetwater.
We got a few wires running around the place here. So what we're going to do today is take you on a tour of different ways that you can wire up and configure your rig. Everything from, what would you say, the traditional into the front of the amp thing to the triple amp, wet, dry, wet, over the top.
We're really doing everything from mono to stereo in front of the amp to 4-cable method to 5-cable method to wet, dry, and wet, dry, wet. So literally every single possible configuration you can do, we're going to cover today.
Right, and we'll be able to do that courtesy of the amazing pedal board that you built for me last time you were here.
That's right.
And there's a video that's been posted that'll take you through that pedal board if you want more details, but Mason set it up to be so flexible that we can do all this wiring from just the one board, which is super cool and obviously very handy for doing videos.
Absolutely, especially when you got this many amps.
Yeah. But the other thing we want you to get out of this is we're going to play through all these different configurations as well, so you can hear what it sounds like when you have a wet dry rig versus a true stereo rig and so on. So we'll have some sound examples and we're going to do some discussion of how all this works. We'll have some diagrams for you. So man, let's dive in and start making some noise.
Can't wait. Let's do it.
So let's start out with the most basic way to set this up. But before we do that, let's take a quick tour of what we're using here.
Yep.
I've got my Fender Strat and coming into the pedal board. And the path then is we come in and it hits the sub and up, which is an octave pedal. And then the Helix, which is a phaser, Neutrino, which is an auto wah. Then 3 different distortion pedals. All those happen to be J-Rockets. And then it actually hits, I think the volume pedal is next, right?
The volume pedal.
Which feeds the tuner as well. And then from the volume pedal to the carbon copy. And then you could choose at that point to either run that out to an effects loop. Or in our case, we're just going to chain it right into the rest of the effects. Which it goes from there to the Lex. Lex to the Ola, which is a chorus, and then into the Starlight delay, and then into the Golden. And so that's the setup here, but the whole thing works because of the interface box that you have here on this. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the interface box that's here, it's the same kind of prototype version of what's now available at Sweetwater. And it basically is a buffered interface that also can act as a routing or patch bay for the entire rig, like a hub that everything plugs into. So this is where your guitar plugs in, all of your amplifier connections also plug in here. It gives you the option to go mono, as we're going to do here, but also stereo, wet, dry, wet, 4-cable method, 5-cable method. Presumably any type of routing configuration that you could think of, it can accommodate, and it provides an input buffer and an output buffer, both mono and stereo. Has isolation for one of those stereo outputs, so you don't have any issues with any sort of ground hum. You also, on this one, have an audition loop, so you can bring in other external effects if you want. We're not going to demonstrate that here, but it even could do that if you wanted to.
In our other video, we actually showed that.
Yeah, in our other video with the pedal board build video, we have that demonstrated, but can really do everything. But for the first purposes, we're using in its most simple configuration, just 2 cables, guitar in and out to amp, with all the pedals in between.
And we've got a Strymon power supply that's driving everything, and we should also mention the pedal board that all this is mounted to.
Yeah, so this is a Tour compact pedal board. It's 26 inches by 14 inches, and then we're using one of our TC2 hinged risers on this guy.
Which I love having that second level because you can hide stuff underneath and all the cable routing and everything, but it also gives you easy access to everything. And we used all of your cabling and all of that stuff to
pedal
to
essentials kits, everything on here. I think
the risers, I think everything on here is Vertex, so which makes for a super clean and given how many tones are available here and the power that's available here, a super compact board as well.
Yeah, for sure.
And then we're coming out of this. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and just the advantage here of being able to fit all this stuff is just, we're building up. We're adding another story, and that just gives us the ability to replicate space to maximize the number of pedals.
So the power supply and the buffer, or the interface box rather, are underneath the shelf. And I could have another pedal into there or something if I, in this case, I don't need anything else, or I probably do, but I haven't put it in there yet. But So we're coming out of there and going into the front of the Mesa Boogie Mark V 25.
Yep.
That's behind me. And that's driving a 1x12 speaker cabinet.
Yep.
And as we'll see later, we have a second one of those that we'll be setting things up in stereo. And then when we get to the triple amp setup, we've got a Mesa Boogie
Triple Crown
50 that we're using as well. And so this is the gear that we have. But let's start at that most basic approach, which is to guitar into pedal board.
Pedalboard to amp.
Pedalboard to amp. And what are the advantages of doing it that way?
Well, I think simplicity, number one. I mean, you only need 2 cables, you need 1 amp, and a power cord for each of them, and you're ready to go. I think that it's clear that if you just want a simple grab-and-go setup, something like this is really, really simple. The disadvantage, though, as we'll see, is that if you want to run into a channel switching amp like this, or an amp that produces distortion, there are some sonic drawbacks that really are not advantageous in terms of running time-based effects like delay and reverb, and we'll get to hear a little bit of why it might be preferable in this situation to just use pedals for distortion as opposed to the amp for distortion.
Right. So let's listen to what's going on here. Again, guitar coming in through the pedal board and then straight into the amp. Is this our clean tone? Now I can add delay on that. I can add reverb, chorus, phaser, and actually from the board I can add and we can add delay to that from here. All that works great.
Yep.
Just simple, easy to use, easy to troubleshoot, easy to set up, but where, like you mentioned, the things may get a bit messier is when we change channels on the amp.
Yep.
So I've got the second channel set up on the Mesa Boogie to have a fair amount of gain.
Yeah.
Now the problem comes when we step on the delay, or in particular the reverb.
Right, and that is a huge contrast to what you just did with pedals making the distortion, but let's hear that.
Right, because now the delayed signal is feeding into the distortion.
Right.
So it's just not as clean, it's not as clear, it's a little messier, a little muddier.
Yeah.
And you might like that. That might be the sound you're going after, and that's fine.
Yeah.
And to be fair, we also could bring the mix down and change our delay parameters.
Yeah.
You know, and make that work a little better. But that much gain has a tendency to compress.
Yeah.
And bring everything out at the same level, so it's tough to get the delay to sit behind.
Yeah, I think it's just not, if we're thinking about the ways that we envision or we kind of hear delay being used in classic recordings that delay was prominent, we almost never hear it in this particular configuration where there is a really, really long delay with a super high gain amp. I use Eddie Van Halen always as this example, and I'm sure that I'll talk about him again because I love him as a player. He used delay in front of a dirty amp, but his delay was so short and sparse, it was almost like a slapback.
Right.
And so you didn't get to hear as much of the distortion on the repeats, because basically, if you're thinking about how we're running it now into a dirty amp, it's almost as though we had taken our distortion pedals and swapped the order with the delay and reverb pedals.
Right.
Because you're having distortion coming after the delay and reverb. And in a typical mono setup in front of a clean amp, you just would never do it that way. Or very rarely would you ever see somebody put delay and reverb before their distortion
Unless
pedals.
it's just a particular sound you're trying to get. And with delay, it's one thing, but it's something else with reverb.
Yeah.
So, and it's hard to, I mean, we could turn the delay down, but the reverb down, but you're still distorting reverb.
Yeah, it just sounds unnatural. It's not like, it's almost like how you wouldn't hear it this way in nature.
You're right. Yeah, it's a different kind of a sound. And again, maybe that's the effect you want.
Yep.
Most commonly you don't. Most commonly you want that reverb to be more clean and more of a studio setup. So that's the one limitation with this is if you are running a distorted channel in your amplifier and all the effects are in front, is that something you have to deal with. And again, to be fair, up until really Randall Smith came out with these amplifiers, that's the way you ran.
Right.
Echoplexes and things had to go into the front of the amp because there were no effects loops.
Absolutely, yeah. There were no effects loops, and but I would also arguably say that amps didn't have as much gain as they did when you started to see effects loops coming out as a consequence of trying to be able to put time-based effects or rack gear in a lot of cases after the preamp section. But I would say for most people, and again, we're speaking broadly here, but I think generally if you're going to be using distortion pedals, you want to be going into a clean amp if you're generating the distortion from the pedals. If you're generating amp gain, then just hang on for a minute or two and you're going to hear how this is demonstrated through 4-cable method and how that really is a game changer for people that are using high gain amps like this and they have the ability to move those time-based effects after the preamp section.
Right. So we're in agreement that this type of a setup tends to work well when you're using your amplifier as a pedal platform.
Absolutely, that's the best way.
And you're just using it as a clean platform and you're adding gain from pedals and things in front of it.
Yep, absolutely.
So we saw how running those time-based effects like reverb and delay and things into the front of the amp, if the amp is distorted, can be kind of problematic sometimes. Yeah. Let's take a look at a way to solve that.
Right.
And that's what has commonly become known as the 4-cable method.
Right, and 4-cable method because the guitar going into the pedal board, that's cable one.
Yep.
And then you have the cable coming out of the pedal board into the front of the amp, which is typically reserved for the kind of dry effects. And then you have send from the amp effects loop coming in to get the wet effects, so that's 3. And then the 4th cable is the output from the last wet effect going back to the return of the effects loop.
Right. So what we've done is we've brought basically the front row of pedals here into the amp as you'd normally run them
straight into the input. Yep.
Right. But then we've come out after the preamp, which is where the send would typically be located, somewhere in that range anyway, area anyway, and place these time-based effects after any gain stages.
Yeah, so you basically have dry effects into preamp, and then between preamp and power amp, the effects loop is basically the insert between those two parts of the amplifier, gets all the time-based effects, and then those come back and feed into the power amp.
Right. So if we're running a clean amp, there's not a heck of a lot of difference.
No.
Right? So So now if we turn these on, we've got the overdrive on the amplifier, now the overdriven sound is feeding into these pedals.
Correct.
Now in this case, we also have our modulation effects, which is the chorus, as well as the rotary speaker from the Lex. Those are post-gain.
Yep.
So we're still getting a clarity there, even though it's modulated distortion.
Yep.
It's modulated distortion instead of distorted modulation.
Correct. Yeah, and it's like I said, when you're running a high gain amp and you're running stuff in front, it's just as if you put your overdrives after your delays and reverbs. And this basically allows us to run it in a signal path that if we were looking at this pedal board and just presuming every pedal was wired into the next, we'd have all of our distortions then running into the delays. They wouldn't be the other way around.
Right.
Delays aren't before. And so what the 4-cable method allows you to do when you have a distorted amp is to create that separation between the amp distortion that happens before and then the reverb and delay can come after that, and so that they don't have any clipping associated with what's getting then repeated. So it's just a much cleaner way to be able to do this, and we're lucky that so many amps now have this feature that have high gain. In the old days, it was just like, you'd suffer through it somehow.
Right. So it's a more studio.
Very much more of a studio application.
Approach, right, where you'd add the effects after.
Absolutely.
After the fact. And so that helps maintain that clarity and that punch.
Absolutely. And I think just compared to mono, again, for distorted amps, I mean, it's a no-brainer. Delays, reverbs, at the very least, should always be in the loop.
Yep, I agree, 100%. Now, I do still have one delay that's in front, but I typically don't use that when I've got a distorted signal because it does get messy.
Yeah, and there's guys that maybe want that effect. Maybe they like, like a Van Halen would be running tape echoes in front of a fairly distorted Marshall amp. And there can be certain effects that we might like to have some delay in, but his delay was very abbreviated. It was a short delay. It wasn't a super, long, echo. And I think that, I think he was able to get away with it in that particular context. I think generally if we're doing ping pong delays, kind of like we have here, it just wouldn't work in that context.
Right, I agree totally. Now let's look at our first stereo setup, which is, for me, I love this when it starts to get dimensional, we'll say. I just love that thing. But we're taking kind of the most basic approach to stereo, which is to run through the pedal board come out of the pedal board in stereo, and then go into the front of the 2 amps.
Right. So every single thing is in series from start to finish. So every pedal goes into the next, and then we start our stereo chain at the Strymon Lex, and then go to the Ola, Starlight, and Golden. So all mono up until the Lex, then everything else that after that is all stereo, and then feeds into the input of the 2 amps.
Right. And as opposed to the last one we were looking at, the 4-cable method, there's nothing in the effects loops here. We're just going straight into the front of the amp.
Yep.
And that has some advantages.
Yep.
Number one, it's easier to set up.
Sure thing.
Because we're 3 cables.
Yep.
And it's pretty direct.
Yep.
But it has some limitations too.
Yep.
Because we now can't really, we could figure out some kind of way to do a Y cable so we could change channels on the 2 amps or whatever, but it's not as clean.
It's definitely harder if you're using channel switching amps. I think the only time to use this particular methodology of stereo is when you don't have any amp distortion present. Right. The amps are clean, you're not depending upon them for doing any sort of channel switching, and especially not relying upon the amps to provide the gain. The gain would all be provided from the pedals on the pedal board.
Right. And the key here is to make sure your pedals are in the right order, so your gain pedals are in front of your time-based pedals and so on.
Yes, correct. You want to treat it where you have, maybe some modulations up front depending on what that might be. Sometimes people like univibes, phasers, flangers, sometimes those up front. And then maybe they have some modulation after, like we have here, like chorus is coming after distortion, and we have rotary coming after distortion, and then of course delay and reverb. And I think as long as you kind of observe sort of the basic sort of ideas around where to put your pedal orders, this is pretty much what you would see in terms of signal path and the order of the major food groups, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing you have to keep in mind is we need to make sure the 2 amps, or it's probably ideal to ensure the 2 amps are set the same.
Right.
So especially volume-wise, because if 1 amp is louder than the other, your whole stereo thing is messed up.
Yeah, and trying to match the settings, typically you'll see most people do if they're doing a stereo setting, unless they're trying to deliberately offset the 2 so that they have maybe different EQs that they fill out or something like that. You generally see that they're set the same, they're on the same channel. That's a pretty common application. That's what we're doing here.
Right. Let's listen. So this is our dry signal. Just a clean sound coming from both amplifiers simultaneously.
Yep.
And both amps are set as close as we could get to getting them into the same setting. But now if we add, say, a stereo delay, we can start getting that stereo effect.
Yep.
Same thing with chorus. And that's a big, wide sound. There's nothing wrong with that at all.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It sounds great, sounds wide. You definitely get that stereo image. The real complication is then when you get into doing anything that's related to using gain on the amps and then trying to replicate that type of delay.
Right.
As we heard a little bit in the mono setting.
Right, exactly. The same kind of thing. But in this case, thanks to your building this board, I've got plenty of gain pedals and options on the board itself, so I can engage. And that overdrive is in front of the delays, so I'm still getting a nice clean, or reverb, whatever it might be. So still getting all that stereo goodness. And,
absolutely.
And we can use the mix control. I've got it turned up fairly high here, but we can use the mix controls to balance the amount of stereo effects to the dry signal. And we get that kind of phantom center image out of it as well. That's a big sound.
Sounds incredible. I love how wide it is. The ping-ponginess is great. Again, using it with pedal distortion, I think, is ideal for this particular setting. But I think very convincing of what amp gain would do. These pedals now, just like the melody here from Rocket, is just another example of just a fantastic analog overdrive that really can sound ampy and tube-like.
Sure, absolutely. And again, we could have other mono effects as well, whether it's the sub and up, or if we do want some phaser. So the phaser is actually mono.
Yeah.
But when we add stereo reverb or stereo delay, it starts to become stereo.
Right.
Because of the stereoizing effects of those other two pedals, or if we ran the chorus or whatever.
And you're still hearing it through both amps, even when it is in mono. You're just not getting sort of the processing of that stereo image.
Right, exactly. So now let's take a look at probably the more common way that people would do stereo, which is to put all the time-based effects into the effects loop.
Yeah.
And spread things out that way. So our signal path in this case is the guitar is coming into the interface box.
Yep.
Coming out of the interface box after it goes through the front row of pedals, basically.
Yep.
Into the input of this amplifier.
Right.
So at this point, we've got just this amp. And we can add effects we want. And so that's feeding into the front of the amp. Then we're coming out of the effects loops end.
Yep.
Of this amplifier back
Yep.
to the interface box.
Yep.
And then we're actually coming out in stereo.
Yep.
To the two effects inputs or effects returns.
Yep.
On the two amplifiers. Why don't you flip the standby on that amp? And so here's our dry sound. And this is probably most dramatic. Right, so we're coming back in and the time-based effects are after the preamp of the amplifier.
Yep. So the great thing about doing it this way is you can change the preamp channels of your main amplifier that we're using, that's kind of the left amplifier, and that's shown in both amps. So you can have one channel that you're switching. This is just being used, the one over my right shoulder, sort of a glorified power amp. So you're having the power amp and both these being present, but only one preamp being used. So again, anytime you change channels, that's going to be demonstrated in both amplifiers. It's not like you have to have a foot switch for each of them so that you could isolate them from each other. They're all going to get the same signal. It's just that it's going to be in stereo.
Right. So if I step on the switch here and go from clean. And that same signal is going through both amps.
Yep.
Now, it's obviously advantageous to use the same amp on both sides so that you get a similar response, similar sound, and you're just making it a stereo presentation.
Yeah, it's definitely better if you have the same exact amp. I mean, obviously, some of us don't have two of the same amps, and that's totally fine. You could still pull this off. It just may not be exactly what you want. If you are going to use two amps, and this just is a general recommendation, I would choose a more linear amp that's cleaner. If you needed to kind of designate one as just the designated power amp, I would use the higher gain channel switching type amp as the dry, and then I would use the more kind of pedestrian, common, cleaner amp as the wet amp, just because that will receive the wet processing a little bit better, a little bit more neutrally, if you had to pick between two amps and kind of choose one versus the other.
Right, but it still works equally well also if you're using them as a pedal platform. So if we've got the clean, and we step on the ML, we're still getting a big sound out of that. We can add chorus on top of it. Chorus is just so much more lush when you put it in stereo, and certainly the rotary speaker. Really sounds nice. Put a little verb in there. There just seems to be a clarity when you go to stereo, where you get kind of a phantom center image, just like when you're working with stereo studio monitors. But there's also that spread that's so lush. Yeah,
I think that this is a really great system if you have stereo pedals and you have amps that have gain. I mean, again, as we talked about earlier with the 4-cable method, kind of the predecessor to this, is that the main reason that people would even go with the 4-cable method is if they wanted to be able to use a high-gain amplifier and also use wet effects, so that they could separate the wet effects from being between the preamp and power amp instead of in front of the preamp, which doesn't have that great of a sound, as you showed us earlier, if you're running a high gain amp like a Mesa Boogie or something similar. So this sort of gives you all those benefits of being able to split the effects that are time-based after the preamp section, before the power amp section, and then being able to just expand that out into stereo and get that big, luscious stereo image and have all the clarity that's associated with a 4-cable method set up, again, splitting your time-based effects after the preamp and then having all the other effects running into the preamp.
Right, exactly. And it's, it's basically bringing one more amplifier and running one more cable than doing the 4-cable method that we looked at before. But the other trade-off, though, the other thing you have to consider with this is most PA systems are still mono. And so, like for example, a lot of situations I play in, it's still a mono sound system. And so you have to be a little careful with how that stereo is going to collapse if you're trying to mic both amps, for example. It's one thing in headphones or in the studio like we have here. But another when you take that on stage, something you need to consider.
And I think that there's many people that, would say that obviously if you can do the 5-cable, you should. If you can do 4-cable, do it. And if you have something like this where you have an interface box that allows you to have the flexibility of both, you don't have to really make that decision. If you have the ability and you have a place that can do a stereo PA, you have the connections to do it. And if you don't, then you just unplug one of them and you're going 4-cable method, And it's that simple. It's like you just have the pedal board, it's already set up to do it, and you just add that extra cable if you need it.
It's very cool. So one other thing I think to think about with this is that it's real easy to get carried away and go over the top and add tons of chorusing and delay and big, huge sounds and all kinds of stuff. And it gets real washy and you can lose some of that punch. But this is also a beautiful thing if all you're doing is adding a nice stereo reverb around the outside of your amplifier, just kind of still just really envelops you and gives you more of a 3D presentation for your guitar, that it makes it easier to play, quite honestly, but it's also just a richer sound, even with all you're doing is a stereo reverb.
Absolutely, definitely. And again, I think part of the 4-cable or the 5-cable method is again, that separation just gives you that extra clarity that we wouldn't have if we were running this all into the front of an amp, especially if we were on the gain channel. I think that if clarity is important to you and you have amps that have effects loops, this is a really great thing to use, in particular if you're using any sort of gain from the amplifier. It's an absolute necessity if you're going to do it that way, if you want to maintain that kind of studio level cleanliness. And I mean, we're getting pretty close, I would say, here to kind of almost a studio process tone using these effects loops, using them in stereo. It's almost akin to what you would hear in a wet dry or wet dry wet rig in terms of the clarity, the spaciousness, and you'll get to hear a little bit of that a little later.
Right. One other thing I do recommend is when I built this board, or you built this board, but when I asked about this board, or we kind of planned it, is I like to have a mono delay that's going into the front of the amplifier. And the reason for that is that it's different than having the ping pong delay. So if we've got the stereo delay, that's great. It kind of adds ambience along with that rhythmic thing. But if you have just a mono delay, it's going to come out of both amps simultaneously. And sometimes that's what you want, is for that to sit there. Now, we could still split that stereo using modulation, sort of the Eric Johnson thing, of running your delay into a stereo chorus. That's a cool thing too, to do that way. So I do like to have I still like to have mono effects in front of the amplifier as well as the stereo effects that are in the loops.
And I think an analog delay like the carbon copy is sort of a really good choice for that. Anything that's just a really simple, a DM2 or an Aquapus or something like that is a great idea, just to put those in front. And honestly, those don't even work that well a lot of times in loops because of the line level output. Sometimes they can clip. This is sort of like a perfect application. You get a little bit of the best of both worlds. You get some delay going into the front, and then you get your really kind of pristine, almost studio quality delays running the loop.
It's a great way to do it. So now let's move to, I don't know if you'd say the next level, but it's kind of a sideways move from the true stereo. And this is going to be what's called wet dry. Tell us what that means.
So wet dry is basically a format where you're separating the wet effects from the dry effects, and it requires that you have one preamp and 2 power amps. So in the case of what we have here, we have our dry amp as the Mesa Boogie Triple Crown. So all of the dry effects, everything from the sub and up through the overdrives to the visual volume and the Carbon Copy Deluxe and Tuner are all running in front of the Triple Crown. Then we're taking a line level output of the triple crown, which is basically just a line level output tapped off of the output transformer that then feeds back into the pedal board, receives all of the wet effects. So in this case, the Lex, Ola, Starlight, and Golden. And then those then feed into the return of the 525 over your left shoulder. And that's only receiving the wet effects into that rig, just the power amp. So we have a preamp and power amp for the dry, and then just a power amp that's receiving the wet.
Right.
So this is allowing us to differentiate between the two, and then you can mix them acoustically. So again, some amps might have a slave control or some sort of volume control for the line level output, or you could get a line out box, or you could use a volume pedal back there and use that to mix in parallel acoustically the dry amp versus the wet amp. And this is really valuable because you can really decide how much processing you want to exist alongside your dry sound. So if you just want a little tiny bit of delay and a tiny bit of reverb and maybe some modulation to kind of help just insulate that dry tone a little bit, you can do that. You can get it to be really over the top. Some people even elect to have a dedicated volume pedal on their rig, and they can blend it in as they desire.
Yeah, I was as you were saying that, I was thinking that two players who I think of doing this kind of thing with a volume pedal to control the effects amp are Steve Morse from the Dregs and now Deep Purple, and Jimmy Herring from Widespread Panic, and also a solo artist. Both of them have a second volume pedal to just control the level of the effects amp. And the advantage to that is everything that you said, you get that separation, the ability to mix, but also sometimes when you're running everything through one amplifier and one power amplifier, it gets a little more jumbly and it's not as clean, it's not as clear.
Absolutely, yeah, because you have one mic and you know, however many speakers you have, 112, 212, 412, that's trying to capture all of this, and typically it's too much for one amp to be able to create all that separation and get that definition. And this just really gives you individual channels on the mixing board to be able to decide how you want that delay to come in parallel with that dry signal. And it just gives you the ultimate amount of control over the individual components of the pedal board, the dry and the wet.
And then you can also pan them as you like. So you could still pan them both to the middle.
Yes, you could.
Or you could move one off to one side and do more of a stereo kind of a thing. Sort of like Van Halen 1, right? Where you got the dry amp on one side and then the reverb delay on the other side.
Yeah, and it just gives you, I mean, you have every flexibility that you would need, because you can make it sound like a mono amp basically, depending on how you pan them, or you can get them to be very sort of dedicated and isolated from each other depending on what you want.
Right. Let's listen. We'll let's turn the standbys on the amps, and we'll start with the dry sound, and then I'll bring the effects in and we'll hear what this does.
Cool. Okay, so I'll leave this one off.
Leave that one off. We'll turn these on. So now this should be our dry signal. We'll add some delay. So the delay is only coming out of this amp. And this one is completely dry. There's no effects in this one at all. If we'll add some reverb in. Where this really makes a difference for me is also with modulation effects, like a chorus. Or with a rotary speaker. It seems much clearer and it stays punchy, even with the modulation effect.
Yeah, and I think, you know, comparatively to you know, using this number of cables going 4-cable method, the real distinction that I'm getting is just there's, even though I'm sitting kind of away from the wet amp, even from this position, I'm still hearing very clear articulation on both ends.
Right.
And I think 4-cable method gives players a lot of that, you know, just by way of separating certain effects from pre and power amp. But here you have totally different channels.
Right.
You know, and even though I'm not listening to it in, you know, from the in headphones on the mixer, I'm still hearing it so differentiated, but so complementary. And I think that is just something that you can't emulate when it's all in one amp or it's all being encapsulated into the same speaker cabinet.
Right. Yeah. It's a very cool effect. Now we can still run effects into the front of this amp, so we could put the bass. And again, the advantage is we get the clear, punchy octave effect through the dry amp, but we're also getting the effects applied to it through a totally separate amp.
Yep. And just the level of mix you can use for the wet is just, you have so much more flexibility to go wetter without losing definition or getting kind of clogged up.
Right. I like this sound.
Yeah.
That's pretty sweet.
Yeah, it sounds incredible. Yeah, whew. Man. What about adding a little delay in front from that carbon copy?
We can do that too.
Let's hear that.
So, to give you an idea, we're back to our dry sound. Now, this delay, the carbon copy, is feeding into the front of the dry amp. So now we can add... That's pretty big sounding.
It is pretty big sounding. I mean, it sounds so big in the middle here, and then it's like, it feels like you hear the dry sound and then it just kind of moves off into this other amp, this ever so slightly.
Yeah, it's very cool.
It's really, like just sitting here, I don't know how it feels through the camera, but it almost feels like vertigo inducing.
So now let's take this concept of wet-dry, where we've got that dry signal giving us the punch and then the effects that are controllable through their own amp, and let's expand it even more. We've added another cable here, we've added yet another amplifier or another microphone, and this is now what would be called a wet-dry rig. And how is that different than what we saw before?
So it's really essentially the exact same thing, except instead of being mono, wet-dry, you have all your dry into one amp and then the wet in the other, you've added another wet amp. So you have a left and right wet, and then the dry center still remains. So it's just a stereo version of the wet-dry rig, and just gives you more dimensionality, bigger sound, and just really being able to bring out even more of those lush clean tones, and then also just kind of having that delay that just kind of wraps around some of those dirty tones, and that reverb that just wraps around some of those dirty tones, and just feels like it's almost like a studio finished product almost when you're hearing it even in a live environment.
Right, and we were talking earlier, you were saying that where you saw this kind of coming up was the players in the studios doing this for themselves, but I kind of saw it from the other end of people trying to recreate the way that it sounded in the studio. So like you go on stage, and when you're in the studio, you put a delay on the left and the right and your dry signal in the middle. And this was a way to take that on stage, but you saw it the other way around.
Yeah, I was looking at a lot of my favorite guitar players in the way that they set up their rigs back in the 80s, and some of my favorite guitar players are all session musicians. And one thing that they would often do is run these wet-dry wet rigs, and one of the big reasons when kind of talking to these guys, because a lot of them are our customers, they said that they did that because if the producer, for whatever reason, didn't like what they had decided to print as far as the processing, they didn't have to have that on the track because they have an individual microphone for their dry, they have an individual microphone for the left wet and the left right. So it was before the days of Pro Tools where they couldn't just punch this stuff in, or they couldn't just add in plugins after the fact. If you were going to try it with chorus or delay or whatever else you wanted to use, that was going to have to be used in the studio. And so this allowed them to be able to try it out with those sounds already there, but they always had the dry reference there. If the producer didn't like the processing that the studio musician chose, they could go back, they could take that sound, add more processing to it after the fact, and again, didn't have all the benefits of being able to use Pro Tools to just bring something in and out a la carte, as you needed it. They really had to sort of be a little bit more premeditated in what they were doing. This is a way they could try out or audition ideas without having any consequence to the dry tone. They could still have a salvageable recording no matter what they did.
Right, and the same thing really holds for live as well, because the front of house engineer always has that dry signal that they can turn up, and they can bring the effects up and down. So it does give more control in that situation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And even if you're using in-ears, it's a huge benefit, I think, as well, because it allows you, even if the sound man, obviously, we're all subject to their mercy, but you can get a pretty good mix for yourself also in your in-ears if you really want to hear more wet in the in-ears mixed with the dry. I think you can get a much better balance of what that feels like. And if you have the number of channels to do it, it's certainly an amazing sensation to be a guitar player and feel like you have that much control over the delay and reverb and any sort of modulation separately from the dry sound.
Right. Until we have Atmos systems for guitar.
Right.
This is kind of the ultimate in spaciousness and immersive audio for guitar players is kind of what we've got here.
Yep.
Let's listen a little bit what's going on here. We'll start with the dry signal, and then I'll bring in some delay, some reverb, some chorus, so you can hear what it sounds like as we blend that along with that dry signal in the middle. So this is our dry. And even just with reverb, I find you can actually run it even wetter.
Absolutely.
Because you've got that punchy dry signal in the middle.
Yeah, you always have the dry reference there, so you always get, and I usually, and most people, typically set the dry amp a little louder than the wet amp so that they always really have a nice reference of where they are, and then you almost just get kind of like this kiss of reverb, it's a warm hug
Wrapping
just coming around you. And you can really, with a lot of the amplifiers that are out there right now, you can actually adjust the level that comes out of the line out. If there is a line out, and you can always get a line out box too that has a control, so you can adjust how much of that wet signal is coming through the wet amp, so you can have, the adjustment of kind of the balance acoustically between the dry and the wet.
Right. Oh, that's the wrong one. We'll turn the chorus on. That's stereo delay. So now we've got stereo chorus, stereo delay, and stereo reverb through the wet amps.
That is
and then the dry signal. And with overdrive, kind of instant 80s, isn't it?
I mean, right away, the thing that's standing out to me is just the clarity, because normally with that much gain, and then you're piling on delay and reverb, it's such a risk to just end up with this soupy mess of delay and reverb. And here, you have that great dry reference, you have that great lead tone coming through, and then you're just insulating it perfectly with that. It doesn't feel like you're competing for space with your own instrument. You know, it's like they're complementing because they're basically in parallel with the dry sound. And you can mix that acoustically in as you want it, and it's an incredible sound.
It is pretty brilliant. I also like the rotary speaker in stereo because the dirt's feeding into that, and you still have enough of the dry to where you don't feel like you've lost all the punch and all the focus. Another cool thing with this is to add a delay through the dry amp, because then that delay is just repeating in the dry amp, but it's also feeding into the delayed and reverbed effects amps, and gives you a pretty cool...
It's almost like the edge.
Yeah, so I've got a pretty long delay right in the center, and then we add the stereo delay and some reverb and even some chorus. That's pretty sweet. That's greasy.
Yeah, I mean, that's great, but still totally clear. Like, you get all, like, the definition as though it was bone dry, and then you just get that insulation of the delay and reverb. It's just the perfect amount.
It is really cool. Okay, so we've listened to the sound of the wet, dry, wet rig. We've talked a little bit about why you'd use it, where it came from. Let's talk about how you set this up and how you wire it. Will you take us through the wiring schematic?
So as far as configuration is concerned, the guitar is coming into the input of the interface box, and it's going through all your dry effects. So it's going through your sub and up, the helix, the neutrino, overdrives, volume pedal, and then it's going out into the input of the dry amp. So in this case, it's the Mesa Boogie Triple Crown. So it's going straight in the input. Then from there, we're taking a line out of the Triple Crown, which is on the back of the amp, and that's feeding back into an input on the interface box, which then feeds the Strymon Lex, then the Lex in stereo to the Ola, Ola in stereo to Starlight in stereo to the Golden, and then back out of the Golden through the interface, and then one side of it is going into the return of the Mesa Boogie 525 on Mitch's left, and the other one, the right side, is going into the return of the 525 on my right, and those are the wet amps on the left and right that are getting those wet effects.
Right.
Yeah, and the only thing to add to that is that the carbon copy is also running in front of the amp. It's not running in the wet chain, as we just heard demonstrated.
So let's do this. Let's leave these bypass. We'll turn on just the center amp. So this is just our dry amp in the center. And we can add this delay in because it's going into the front of the amp.
Right.
But now when we turn on the standby on the Mark Vs, we'll hear the stereo effects come in. That's a huge tone.
It's a huge tone. I mean, you really just saw it went from here, great tone.
Yeah.
But here, just like great tone plus two more great tones that are just, again, just insulating everything you do in, you know, with a lot of these amps, as I said, a lot of Mesa Boogie amps, they will sometimes have a control where you can adjust the volume of it. You could also just put a volume pedal back there to adjust the amount of effect that's coming back into the wet effects or the wet amp. And so there's other ways to be able to control this if you don't have that controller, again, buy a line outbox. But that's such a huge sound, and you know, in terms of cabling, is not that much more than doing a 5-cable method or a stereo method. If you have the 3 amps to be able to accommodate it, I mean, this is pretty glorious if you're able to.
That is definitely true. Actually, this is a 5-cable method too.
Yeah, this is 5-cable method as well.
So same as running a stereo.
Same as running a stereo rig, and you know, you got to hear what that sounds like. But for some reason, the ability to sort of have these separated, where you're getting your separate preamp, or you're getting one preamp that then's feeding into separate power amps. You have 3 separate power amps running here, 2 of them being wet, 1 of them being dry. There's something about this sound that you can see why it was just like the go-to thing for rock stars and session guitar players. It just has a thing that
it's so cool.
It's irreplaceable. I mean, there's nothing else that quite does it exactly the same.
Right, and you could scale this.
Yeah,
you could take 3 Princetons. And have well, they wouldn't have an effects loop, but you could do it into the front of the amp, and well, that'd be a difficult thing to do. But you get the point. You could take 3 small amps and have a pretty compact rig.
I think that one of the easiest amps to do this with is actually the Fender Hot Rods, because they're fairly affordable. They already have effects loops, so you could use those as your wet amps if you wanted a combo. You know, it's a 112, 40 watts. You could go into the returns.
Right.
You know, that could definitely be workable as that. And another thing that people could also do on this is you could use a power amp cabinet simulation.
Sure.
So you could use something like a Cab M from 2 Notes is a great idea that has power amp emulation already built into it. You can choose the type of power tube that you want, and it has the cabinet itself being emulated and the mic choices. So you can pretty much completely represent sort of what we're doing here on the 2 left and right wet sides with the 525s. You could use some sort of cab simulation for that, have a balanced out, and that could go into the front of house. And if you're running in-ears or you have wedges in front of you, you're still going to be able to hear that. The audience is most certainly going to hear that, and that could be a scaled down way to represent something similar to this. Maybe it's not as great as a Mesa Boogie, but of course it's a smaller way, again, to make this still scalable and be able to go different routes depending on what you have size for, what you have the budget for.
Right, yeah, at that point you've basically got your wet stereo rig on your pedal board.
Yes, exactly.
With that up. Yeah, very, very cool idea. So, man, this has been a bunch of fun, right?
Yeah, this is great. I mean, I think that the coolest thing from the viewer perspective here is you really got to see, I think, whether the juice was worth the squeeze as far as Do you want to connect this many cables and have this many amplifiers potentially on stage to do a wet, dry, wet? As glorious as it sounds, there's obviously, a consequence to doing that, to your back, to your pocketbook potentially.
Yep.
But it sounds amazing, and is it worth it to maybe go 5-cable method, which I think is a really close approximation of wet, dry, wet? Or do you want to go just straight ahead stereo in front of the amp, or mono, or 4-cable method? You really have everything in front of you here to make the evaluation as to whether it's worth it or not. And really, these pedals are just representative. These could be any delay, any reverb, any chorus, whatever. It doesn't matter what the products are. These are just sort of representative. You could really pull this off with gear that you already have, so long as you're able to make these many connections and you have the amps to be able to do it with.
The other thing about it is that it's really a scalable situation.
Yep.
So we could take just one amp and a pedal board, or any pedal board, like you said, or you can ramp it all the way up to the over-the-top kind of situation and go even bigger than this if you wanted to.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of the buffer interface boxes that you guys have here of ours, that it gives you all the scalability of being able to go from mono, just 2 cables, all the way up to whatever cable. We have 7 or 8 cables here now to do a wet, dry, wet rig. So it can really give you the flexibility to go any way that you want on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, thanks so much for spending, I guess it's been pretty much the whole afternoon here that we've been having fun with this. I really appreciate your time and your expertise.
It was a blast, and it's always great to hang out here at Sweetwater and get to hear Mitch Gallagher playing a little guitar.
Oh, man, well, the pleasure's all mine. We've been having a lot of fun.
Yeah, indeed.
Great to see you.
Thanks, Mitch.
Thank you. And thanks for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this look at all the different ways you can configure an amplifier setup and an effects setup. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Each gives their own result. It's up to you which one's going to work best. I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater.